Well, it's great to be with everybody here today. We are living in unprecedented times. We are dealing with a health emergency, an economic emergency, a moment of racial reckoning. As my friend Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, has said, it's like living in 1918, 1932, and 1968 all at the same time. We're also facing a transportation and infrastructure emergency, one that is hitting Americans very differently. While many of us worked from home, millions of essential workers still had to commute every day to service jobs and jobs along the supply chain. And these workers we all counted on were also those that were more likely to come from Black and Brown communities and less likely to own cars and be more dependent on transit services that were cut during the pandemic. In many ways, 2020 made clear what's always been true. Transportation policy is economic policy, it's environmental policy, it's equity policy. It's about access to healthcare, to schools, to jobs, to opportunities. But even before the pandemic, our transportation system was broken. It was dangerous, with 42,000 deaths and almost 5 million people seriously injured every year. It was deteriorating. According to a recent report from the American Society of Civil Engineers, there's a $786 billion backlog in just maintaining the bridges and roads and tunnels that we have. It's unhealthy, with emissions from cars being the #1 cause of US pollution. And too many people don't have reliable transit, don't have city sidewalks or safe crossings, and biking is nearly impossible in many cities. And now at the center of all this is Secretary Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who was sworn in as Transportation Secretary just last month. As someone who's worked for a mayor, I have great appreciation for mayoral innovation and hustle, hallmarks of Mayor Pete's tenure. And it's been good seeing you riding bikes and fighting for Amtrak, and I'd love to see you ride the New York City subways when you are running for president. Mr. Secretary, as I've just outlined, transportation is much more than cars and trucks and things that go. Millions of Americans are still out of work, and we are not out of the pandemic yet. How can transportation policy help ensure that the recovery reaches everybody, especially the Black and Brown communities who've been left out since long before the pandemic?
Well, thanks for such an important question. Thanks for your work, which I've long admired, and for the chance to be here. I think your question goes right to the heart of where we are right now. Not only a problem of historic proportions, but a historic opportunity to deliver solutions. Look, we're at a moment where, as you pointed out, we're approaching $1 trillion backlog in terms of work that we need to do just to maintain and responsibly look after what we've already got. And we know that we've got to go beyond that in order to make sure that we have the resources that communities need for the road ahead. We also know that other countries are getting ahead of us. You look at the investments that China is making, more than the US and Europe combined right now on infrastructure. Add to that the fact that there is a history of federal policy that has not only sometimes let some communities down, has sometimes actively made things worse for many communities, disproportionately Black and Brown Americans in the neighborhoods they live in. So just as sometimes investments in things like great sidewalks or good transit resources failed to come to a neighborhood where most people were living in a minoritized or disempowered group, sometimes the investment came to that neighborhood in the form of, for example, a highway dividing it. Now's our chance to do something about that. Knowing that we have no choice but to make big investments in our infrastructure, we also have to make those new investments in more equitable ways than what we had before. That's the significance of the Justice 40 initiative in the Biden-Harris administration. Justice 40 because 40% of our investment is being directed to those who have been historically excluded or disinvested in the past. Now, another thing that I think will be very important as we undertake the kind of infrastructure investments that I hope and believe are ahead is to think about the jobs that are being created to deliver those investments. What kind of businesses, what kind of workers are getting to do the work that we are about to create? We've got to be intentional about that. It's not a simple challenge, but it's an incredibly important one. Now, we're not waiting for big infrastructure bills to pass in order to act. In my first 30 days, we've already been taking the steps that we can with the discretion that I have here at the Department of Transportation. Just to give you one example, the infra grants, formerly known as FastLane, when the notice went out on those funding opportunities in hundreds of millions of dollars of grant funding, we made very clear that we expect communities applying for that funding to consider and present what they can do for issues of climate and for issues of racial and economic equity as part of their planning. And I think that's a down payment on what we might be able to do going forward. So bottom line, you cannot talk about infrastructure policy without talking about equity. And now's a chance to do right by both of those imperatives.
Mr. Secretary, I have to say it's such a breath of fresh air to hear about investments being driven by outcomes and not just continuing to do the same things over and over again and expecting different results. So you talked about the infrastructure investments ahead and intentional investments. And I wonder, with less than half of Americans having access to public transit today, when he was running for president, Joe Biden campaigned on a goal of bringing public transit to all American cities with 100,000 people or more by 2030. I wonder, how will you do that? And how do you see access to transit as an equity policy?
Well, we've got to recognize that safety isn't just about technological features on vehicles. It's about how we design our communities, how we design our neighborhoods and our streets to make sure people have safe options and good ways to get around. As you mentioned, far too many Americans don't have access to transit at all. And again, there are a lot of issues of racial equity at stake here. Certainly black and brown people are much more likely to face serious injury or fatalities walking and biking. So we've got to make sure that we are supporting communities, which often know better than we might here in Washington exactly what they need. Not all of the answers have to come from Washington, but a lot more of the resources should. It's about recognizing that one size won't fit all. For some communities, what's really needed is a subway stop with transit-oriented development happening around it. For another community, the most important thing might be just making sure that there are adequate sidewalks to get kids to school, and then encouraging, as we would in South Bend, using safe routes to school resources delivered through federal policy, to do things like walking school buses to encourage that process of a community taking kids to where they needed to go, and encouraging kids to form healthy and safe habits in terms of how they get around and get to school. This is a dollars and cents issue. It's part of what's at stake in our conversation this year about infrastructure, but it's also a question of whose interests are being considered, including those who haven't had a voice, whether we're talking about children or whether we're talking about communities that have been politically disempowered in the past.
Those are such important points that you just made, and we're actually fortunate to be joined by Phil Washington, who is a visionary leader and the outgoing CEO of LA Metro. He had a highly successful tenure in Denver, running the transit agency there, and he's an old friend. Phil, since 2015, you've managed one of the nation's largest transit agencies with 11,000 employees and some $20 billion in infrastructure projects underway right now. You're exceptional in this industry in that you're a black man from the south side of Chicago running a major transit agency in an industry that's overwhelmingly white. And transportation inequity and the lack of access to transit are problems in many cities across this nation. I wonder if you've experienced this yourself, and do you think that black needs are represented in transportation planning, and how do you see your role in addressing it?
Well, first of all, Jeanette, thank you for having me. Great to see you again, and I'm thrilled to be on with the Secretary. I think Secretary Buttigieg is going to be a fantastic Secretary of Transportation. Great question. I am not just a CEO, of course. I am, as you said, a black man with a black son. I have a lived experience. I'm a child of the civil rights movement. My mother took me to marches. And once again, we're having that conversation with ourselves as it relates to inequities in this country. and many of those are around transportation infrastructure. The Secretary talked about our history around this. Being from the south side of Chicago, and I must have a shout out for my community, Argyle Gardens. And this is something that I talked to my friend Dorval Carter at the Chicago Transit Authority a lot about the extension of the Red Line to provide opportunities for people that are living in public housing. I think when we begin to talk about whether we have good representation in our communities, I don't think we do. When you talk about the opportunity to plan one's own community, that is a very, very important thing. When we talk about things like local hire, when I was a kid, I saw people building infrastructure in my community that did not look like me. And when I went to find a job, I was either told one or two things, that you're not trained or you're too late. And so, how great would it be if you are planning and designing your own community? How powerful would that be? And so, the opportunity here to operationalize equity becomes very, very important, at least in my mind. That's kind of what we're doing out here in Los Angeles. And I'd also say, in terms of sort of my perspective on the civil unrest and what has happened over the last year or so, hey, Black lives do matter. And it's important to say that because constitutionally, there was a time when Black lives did not matter, when a Black man was 3/5 human. And so I think when we look at infrastructure, and not just transportation infrastructure, but all kinds of infrastructure, I think we have to realize that we are really, I like to say, a socio-economic enabler. I mean, I can remember when my sister took a bus in the city of Chicago from one end of Chicago to go to college. The first person in our family going to college took her 2.5 hours to get from one end of Chicago to the other end of Chicago to go to school. She did it every day for 4 years, and all of us had to chip in for that. So I think what we're doing here and what the Secretary is talking about is so relevant to all communities, to include tribal nations as well.
Hmm. One of the issues I'm going to ask both of you, keeping trains, this transit is such a critical lifeline for so many communities, and Phil, keeping trains and buses running is a challenge even when things are good, and it's especially difficult during a health crisis. And, as the secretary knows, ridership is down almost 80% nationally. It's down 50% on LA Metro. So how do we see this playing out? What do we think is the key to getting riders to come back to transit, to come back to Metro?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do, obviously, is we have to regain the confidence of riders out there. There are essential workers. I mean, we see a lot of them, not just here in Los Angeles, but all over the country. And they kept riding. Now, at reduced numbers, we know that, but they kept riding. We typically move about 1.2 million people a day on our system. We got down to about 300,000. We're back up to about 700,000, 650, 700,000 a day, and it's climbing. We need the public's confidence, renewed confidence. We need to focus on strengthened cleaning protocols. We need to focus on mask wearing, mask mandates. And we also need to focus on air ventilation on buses and trains. And so I think if we focus on those things, which we're doing, and of course the vaccinations, the program, the president has been doing a fantastic job with that. I think we will have that ridership come back. But I will say this, ridership cannot be our only metric of effectiveness. There are obviously environmental benefits. There are so many other benefits. We have been hooked on that metric for years and years and years. It is important, we know that, but we need to include more metrics. And I will say as well, Jeanette, that I have said, and we are working on a Fairless initiative here in Los Angeles too. I've said that I believe we've got a moral obligation to the most diverse county in America to pursue a fairless system to sort of unburden them from the effects of the pandemic right now. And so we're pushing that forward. And I think, just in my mind, I think that is the future of transit, a fairless system.
That's really interesting. And Mr. Secretary, you've also spoken of, generational opportunities to transform transportation. Does this mean rethinking how we fund transportation with long-term investments in public transit, rethinking the agenda, looking at walking and biking to give people more affordable alternatives to driving? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above and more. Actually, let me just take a second because this is my first chance publicly to thank Phil Washington for his leadership of the agency review team, which helped prepare me for this role during the transition. So very much in your debt for the expertise and leadership you brought there, and so glad that we're together now. To your question, Jeanette, yes, this is our opportunity to think big and think whole. About what it means to have infrastructure serving everybody, empowering everyone to thrive in a way that would make us proud looking back 20 or 100 years from now. Now, what does that actually look like in terms of the issues that we're going after? Well, of course, economic strength, equitable economic development, and equity and justice writ large. Getting ahead of this climate challenge. Look, if transportation is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases of any sector in the U.S., then it's poised to be the biggest part of the solution too. And this is our chance to position American families and workers and small businesses to compete and thrive in an increasingly complicated global economy, even if we're just looking after how somebody moves around their own neighborhood. We're always going to be focused on safety first, and sometimes, again, that involves an elaborate technological solution. Sometimes it's just making sure that we filled a hole in the road. We've got to be ready to balance the old and the new, the responsible stewardship of the assets that we've already got that have been systematically disinvested in for a generation, and the ability to look to things that weren't possible before and deliver them. I'm convinced that there is a once-in-a-lifetime combination of factors right now. An impatient public, a level of bipartisan interest and attention, a demonstrated need, historically low interest rates, and a supportive president that could make this the moment to do what needs to be done for the foreseeable and unforeseeable future in America. That's what we have a chance to do something about, and that goes to everything from micro-mobility, how a scooter or a bike can be available to somebody to safely get to work, all the way through to some of the most futuristic and complex technologies imaginable that might reshape what transportation looks like a generation from now.
Well, that's very exciting, and I want to thank both of you for being in this discussion today. Mr. Secretary, for the moonshot for mobility that we're going to be seeing from the administration, and Phil, for your leadership in LA, which has been so transformative, not only in LA, but as an example to cities around the country and indeed around the world. I think we are in a unique moment, poised to achieve the kind of outcomes that the Secretary has talked about, that the President has talked about, and really make infrastructure real and not just a hashtag or a punchline, which it's been for far too long in recent years. So thank both of you, and look forward to continuing the conversation soon.
Thank you.